During his visit to Lithuania, Pope John Paul II blessed the nation and the Church that had withstood all of the persecutions. Here he paid special attention to the Hill of Crosses. John Paul II said, "Let this hill that marks the end of the second millennium of Christianity call all the peoples to a new third millennium full of the hope for salvation based on the suffering and the resurrection of the Savior." Today, we are talking about one of those silent but tough witnesses who brought the sacrifice of life and faith. He was little known, but he did so much that the gospel of Christ reached the hearts of people. He was not frightened by prisons. In fact, the faith of a prisoner even more hardened him. His martyrdom made Archbishop Teofilius Matulionis shine in the Golgotha of the people. Blessed Martyr, a glance to the life of Archbishop Teofilius Matulionis. We can be proud that God's providence gave the gift of Archbishop Matulionis to Lithuania, a true giant of the soul, tested and hardened in Soviet Russia, at a very hard time in the tragic collisions of the 20th century. In 1934, during his visit to the Holy Father, Father Matulionis knelt with the greatest respect in front of Pope Pius XI and asked to be blessed by him. The Blessed Father raised him. Then he himself knelt in front of Father Teofilius. "You are the martyr. You must bless me first." And only then he let the Archbishop to greet him as a pastor. 2 years later, in 1936, the Holy Father Pius XI told to the group of Lithuanian pilgrims that were visiting him about Archbishop Teofilius. Great honor to the Lithuanian people that raised to the world such a hero. Who was he, this humble and peaceful man who was so famous beyond the borders of his own homeland? Teofilius Matulionis was born in Anykščiai, studied in Daugpilis High School. He became a priest in St. Petersburg Seminary. Later he spent almost 10 years serving as a parish priest in Latvia. As a bishop, he became famous in Petrograd during the difficult times of the Bolshevik Revolution. Upon his return to Lithuania, he was nominated as a bishop in Kaišiadorys and experienced all the persecutions of the church from both totalitarian governments, the Germans and later the communists. The life of Archbishop Teofilius Matulionis, with its contrasts, surpassed far beyond the quiet and comfortable life of simplicity. The Archbishop lived through 3 imprisonments in Bolshevik and later on in communist prisons in Moscow, Solovki, and Vladimir. In all, he would spend 16 years of his life in prison. God is love, we read in the Bible. And God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have the eternal life. God gave us this remarkable personality, Archbishop Teofilius Matulionis, that throughout all those years of violence and compulsion that he had to live through, he would be like an unquenchable star, sparkling with God's love and kindness to people. His personality shines until the present day. Archbishop was born on June 22nd of 1873 near the little town Alanta at the intersection of Anykščiai and Molėtai regions. In the family of Jurgis and Ona Matulionai, he was a second son. His parents gave him the name Teofilius. They couldn't possibly know then that by his name they predestined the future of their son. Teofilius in Greek means God's lover. Soon after his birth, the baby was baptized in Alanta church. Teofilius has been listed into the book of birth registration in Russian, because at that time Russian was the official language of the documents. As every Christian, by his baptism, Teofilius Matulionis started his personal journey of life and faith. When little Teofilius was 4 years old, his mother died, giving birth to the 4th child. Only sometime later, Teofilius would come to know the last words of his mother, and she said before her death, "I leave my 3 boys to the guardianship of the Sacred Heart of Jesus." Teofilius' relationship to his Lord throughout his entire life will grow and blossom as God's lover. Being nourished with inspiration, strength, and peace, he found in the Sacred Heart of Jesus. His future life showed that the Lord listened to the prayer of his dying mother. The first church that he was appointed to as parish priest was the Church of the Sacred Heart of Jesus in the town of Biography in Latvia. He was also parish priest in another church that bore the name of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. It was in Sankt Petersburg behind the gates of the Neva River. On the very threshold of the 20th century, the century where mankind couldn't even imagine the historical cataclysms, revolutions, and 2 world wars, on March 4th of 1900, on the feast day of St. Casimir, patron of Lithuania, Teofilius was consecrated as a priest in St. Petersburg. Teofilius started his pastoral service and devoted himself to it completely with enthusiasm and pursued it for the rest of his life until his very last breath. In 1909, after 9 years of work, Father Teofilius Matulionis encountered for the first time the persecution of the Tsar's authorities. He was accused for the baptism of a weak child whose mother was of the Orthodox faith. It was strictly prohibited by the Tsar's laws to baptize a baby if one of his parents was not a Catholic. One Russian priest accused Teofilius at the court of Rezenka County. According to the law, the priest was to be convicted for 3 months of imprisonment. After appeal, the court of St. Petersburg mitigated the conviction. Father Teofilius was removed from church office for 3 months, but the trial revealed his spiritual wealth. During the process, he shined with his vivid and strong faith, his love for truth and spiritual harmony. This event was one of great significance for Father Teofilius' destiny and future. In 1910, he moved to the city on the banks of the Neva River, this time for a longer period. Having joined the work of parish service in St. Petersburg, Father Teofilius would spend 20 years there. At the end of that period, his great devotion to pastoral activities were appraised for their true worth, and in 1922 he was consecrated a bishop. Since Father Teofilius knew several languages, he was an irreplaceable and tireless person in pastoral service. He was able to serve Lithuanians, Latvians, Russians, and Poles in their native languages, both in the confessional and in the pulpit. But Father Teofilius was not impressed by the grandeur of St. Petersburg. He did not become friends neither with the nobles nor with the wealthy. At that time, the workers of 3 nationalities, Lithuanians, Poles, and Latvians, who lived 10 kilometers from the center of the city, behind the gates of the Neva River, established a new parish and built a church of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. At the request of the workers, the governor nominated Teofilius to lead the newly established parish at the Sacred Heart of Jesus and continue the works of construction. Father Teofilius enthusiastically joined in the building not only of the material, but also of the spiritual church, while staying for some time as a vicar of St. Catherine's Church. He used to visit the sick parishioners in the hospitals and at home, the rich and the poor, diligent people as well as those who were very ill, including those with mental illnesses. His humility and zeal in spiritual matters, as well as his tireless activity in building the new church, fascinated everybody, and he gained the greatest respect not only from his parishioners, but also from all of the citizens of the city. In 1917, after the thunder of Aurora's guns, Petrograd became the revolutionary capital of the Bolsheviks. The Zimny Palace was taken by assault, ministers were arrested, the Tsar resigned the throne, and the Revolutionary Committee came to power. The streets of Petrograd had been flooded with crowds, and the Red Revolution soon embraced the whole of Russia. Petrograd and the whole of Russia was devastated by the revolution and condemned to hunger. People were leaving the starving city. Father Teofilius Matulionis was working at the time in Petrograd in the Church of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. he decided to stay in the city even until death in order to be the apostle of people in need for God's strength and help. When the Bolsheviks took over the power, the churches were closed one by one and priests were arrested. The European press wrote extensively about the priest's trial and imprisonment in Moscow, emphasizing in the newspaper titles that Russian Bolshevism persecutes Christianity. While looking back at the end of this age, we can notice some common features of the fate of the 20th century's Christians that relate them with the Christians of the first ages. The motives are surprisingly similar, not only architectural but also ideological ones. The persecuted Christians of the first ages found shelter in the catacombs. The Soviet prisons and the camps in Siberia served as the catacombs for the martyrs of our age, but the Christians were put there not by their own will, but by the will of their persecutors. The light of faith that burned in the heart of prisoner Teofilius Matulionis did not die out in the labyrinths of prison. It burst into the zeal of the soul's pastor. Having spent in prison more than 2 years, in the early spring of 1925, he returned to Petrograd, in spite of the hope of the Soviet authorities that the persecuted priest will leave Russia as many other priests did. When we look at the prayer book that Father Teofilius wrote with his own hand in Latin and in Lithuanian in 1926, we can notice that in his pastoral service, in the presence of all persecutions and troubles, in the center of his attention lies Christ and his divine gospel, that which provides peace and salvation to the world and to people. Everyday prayers written with love and care in a particular calligraphy show Father Theophilus' trust in the Holy Spirit of God and also in Mary, the Christian's mediator and protector. It also testifies to his continual relation to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, in which he found all peace and inspiration of love. Pope Pius XI, knowing about the difficult situation of Catholics in Russia, where many priests have moved abroad and many more were still kept in prisons, did every effort to maintain the hierarchy of this country. In 1929, Pope Pius XI consecrated 3 priests serving in Russia to be bishops, including the young priest Teofilius Matulionis. The consecration was absolutely secret. Bishop Maletsky, in his chapel in Leningrad, in the presence of 2 witnesses, among them was also Father Augustinas Pronskietis, consecrated Father Teofilius Matulionis as a bishop and appointed him to be his auxiliary bishop for the region of Leningrad. In the end of 1929, Bishop Teofilius Matulionis was arrested by the Bolsheviks for the 2nd time. This time he was imprisoned without any trial in Spalerno prison in Leningrad. A year later, after numerous inquests, the bishop was exiled for 10 years to the infamous Solovki Isles, the only reason priesthood, unless you become an agent of the KGB. In Solovki, Bishop Teofilius was not alone. There he met many other priests, about 50 clergymen, including several Orthodox believers. The conditions of living and forced, exhausting labor were especially hard in Solovki. With the feeling of the strength of faith and the support of Christian hope, the priests, like catacomb Christians, used to get up in the middle of the night and in groups of 3 or 4, in absolute secrecy, they walked upstairs to the loft where in the cold, without the altar and liturgical tools, they celebrated Holy Mass. They took care of the imprisoned believers and rendered them all spiritual consolation. A few years later, Bishop Teofilius was moved to solitary confinement near the lake Ladoga in Leningrad. The life and work became even harder because of the swamps that surrounded the prison. The prisoners had to carry the logs and branches on their shoulders throughout the swamps for the building of a new road. If the prisoners performed the given work, they received some bread. However, if they did not manage to do that, they had to starve. Because of that work, Theophilus became physically disabled. In the end of 1933, the Soviet Union exchanged prisoners with independent Lithuania. Bishop Teofilius, 10 other priests and a few laymen were exchanged for the communists imprisoned in Lithuania. Having spent 8 years in the Soviet prisons, Bishop Teofilius Matulionis was met in independent Lithuania with the greatest respect as the Bishop Martyr. We met for the first time in February of 1934 in Alanta, when he returned home from prison. From the very beginning, he made upon me an extraordinary impression as a surprisingly noble personality. I never saw him angry. He never complained of what he had to suffer, and never said any bad word about his interrogators and chief wardens. And yet he had suffered so much. In the spring of 1934, Bishop Matulionis spent a few months back in his homeland and recovered somewhat. He also met his old friends in Lithuania and Latvia. In the spring of that year, he decided to visit the Holy Father and thank him for the support while he was in prison and for the trust that was shown in him when he was consecrated as a bishop in Russia. From the very onset of the revolution, Pope Pius XI very attentively observed the plight of Catholics in Russia and provided all kinds of support for the believers in that country. During the meeting in Rome, Bishop Teofilius was honored by special attention of the Pope. The Holy Father first of all asked Bishop Martyr Teofilius to bless him, and only after that agreed to bestow upon him his apostolic blessing. In the autumn of 1934, the Lithuanians of America invited Bishop Teofilius to visit the United States. He stayed there for almost 2 years and visited 15 major immigrant communities where he met many compatriots. He aroused great interest in America since he was known as the Catholic Bishop of Russia. The American media attentively followed his every step and speech. Having survived the revolution of Russia and of the Bolsheviks, Bishop Teofilius Matulionis was a live witness who dispelled the myth of the Soviet paradise that was being indoctrinated to the minds of the Americans by the communistic American press. Without any anger or revenge, Teofilius revealed the reality of life in Russia. He spoke bravely about the persecution of the believers, numerous arrests, searches, night inquests, brutal trial decisions, and unbearable conditions of starving prisoners. After a year and a half in America, the bishop went to Egypt and spent a month in the Holy Land. He visited Mount Carmel, the Lake of Gennesaret, the holy places of Jerusalem, and celebrated Holy Mass at the burial site of Jesus. After his return to Lithuania in 1936, Archbishop of Kaunas Juozapas Skvirackas designated Bishop Teofilius as the rector of the Benedictine Church in Kaunas. In this church, the bishop established perpetual adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. While he lived in Lithuania, Teofilius Matulionis cherished in his heart perpetual care of the missions in Russia. He was the last bishop who had guided Russian Catholics to survival. After the breakout of World War II, he wanted to renew the missions and searched for the priests who would go together with him for work in Russia. However, life itself turned the fate of Bishop Teofilius Matulionis to another direction. When the Catholic Church in Lithuania experienced the extremely difficult time of persecution during the war and post-war periods, history brought Bishop Teofilius to the first ranks of resistance. In the beginning of 1943, after the death of the first bishop of Kaišiadorys, Juozapas Kukta, the Pope appointed Teofilius Matulionis to be the pastor of Kaišiadorys diocese. While Lithuania suffered the German and very soon afterwards the Soviet occupations, the bishop ingeniously carried out his mission entrusted to him by the Lord with the help of his experience and wisdom, profound peace of mind, and pastoral love. That was a time when life demanded an extraordinary sacrifice from the Christians again. Here again started repressions against the bishops, And in December of 1946, Teofilius Matulionis was arrested for the third time. Almost a whole year he was interrogated in the brutal KGB headquarters in Vilnius. They kept him in that ward that was accommodated for 2 or 3 prisoners, together with 30 other men. Among them were Archbishop Mečislovas Reinys, Bishop Pranas Ramanauskas, and Bishop Vincentas Borisevičius. Bishop Teofilius Matulionis spent an entire year in the cellars of the KGB in Vilnius. He was 74 years old when he was convicted for 7 years of prison and sent to the Vladimir prison in Russia that was known as a prison of a particularly strict regime. Archbishop Mečislovas Reinys was not able to survive the brutal conditions of imprisonment and died in this very same prison. After the 7 years, when the time of imprisonment was completed, absolutely exhausted and worn out by the brutal conditions and inhumane treatment, Bishop Teofilius was not released from imprisonment. Teofilius Matulionis was moved to the Potmo Home for the Disabled in Mordovia. Documents that were found in the KGB archives show that security was especially afraid of Bishop Teofilius, even still imprisoned in Vladimir prison. KGB did its best that this one of the greatest authorities of the Lithuanian Catholic Church would not return to his motherland. But even suffering the hardest conditions of the prison, the bishop trusted in God. In the letter of his friends, he wrote, "I agree with God's will completely. Let his holy will be honored. His persecution in the Potmo Home for the disabled continued." We went there. He was lying there, very weak, quite sick. When we met, he couldn't even utter a word. Neither he nor we spoke. And only after a while he said, "How did you come here?" And then we started to talk. We hadn't seen each other for so many years. He was so excited, and so were we. He was quite sick. The doctor said, "His state is critical and hopeless." When we were leaving, we bade farewell forever. We really did not expect to see him ever again. My father was told that the chief physician ordered to get rid of Matulionis, to poison him. He gave the nurse some medicine that Matulionis was forced to drink every day. Then the nurse warned my father. She was Russian, but a very brave woman. She said, "I can't refuse giving him that medicine, and yet I am giving him that poison every day. I can't do anything because this is the order of the chief doctor." But she said, "I do not want to do that any longer, so I ask you, please, do everything to discharge him from the hospital." When Bishop Theophilus was discharged from Patmo Hospital, he indeed got better very soon. This hopeless patient started to recover little by little and soon became stronger. Fate was generous to the bishop. As persecuted patriarch and spiritual authority of the church, he still had some work to do in Lithuania. He used to say, "It's important not to take everything to one's heart. It's important to trust in God, to trust in Him more and more. If it is God's will, we all stay alive wherever we are." Sometimes he told me of some of the moments of his life, how many times the death was looking straight into his eyes, and his face showed that. He was not afraid to look at people into their eyes, being absolutely sure that nobody will do anything to him if it is not God's will. Looking over his life, Bishop Theophilus explained to his friends that the 3 crosses on the bishop's emblem that he chose should mean 3 important periods in his life: studies, priesthood, and the consecration as bishop. But life actually showed that there is another meaning of the 3 crosses. He was imprisoned 3 times, 2 smaller crosses and a larger one. The 3rd imprisonment was the hardest one. It lasted for 10 years. In 1956, the bishop returned to his motherland and settled in Vilnius at Father Ioannis's apartment. The KGB didn't take their eyes off of him and intrusively persecuted the bishop, who was then already 84 years old. He was not allowed to hold a service in church, so he did so in his room. I made a little altar for him in his room, and there he celebrated Mass in the same room where he lived. But he still would go to church, and he would wear a cassock and all of the ecclesiastical insignia, and he prayed there, but state security did not allow him to hold any service within the church. The documents of KGB archives testify that the state security were extremely afraid that Bishop Teofilius could organize a united resistance of the church authority to the Soviet government. The Catholic Church and its clergymen, who had categorically refused to collaborate with the Soviet authorities, were considered by the state security to be the greatest power causing danger to Soviet Lithuania. But in the Soviet camps and prisons, the hardened bishop maintained peace of mind given to him by God and conducted church affairs with the greatest wisdom. He never worried, and he used to tell me, "Father, don't be afraid. God sees everything. It is for God's honor." Taking into account his old age, Bishop Teofilius found a successor for himself, and paying no attention to the interdiction of the Soviet government, he consecrated him as bishop. In the late night of Christmas Eve in 1957, Bishop Matulionis consecrated Father Vincentas Slatkevičius to be his auxiliary bishop. Later on, he was to become the Cardinal of Lithuania and spiritual guardian of the rebirth of Lithuanian independence. We always felt that the spirit of the blessings of the Mount Sermon were present both within his person and within his words. The secret consecration of Father Slatkevičius to be bishop, forbidden by Soviet authorities but permitted by the Holy See, made the KGB furious. He never blamed or judged anybody. "What can we do?" he used to say. "This is their service." When he saw them coming, and alas, they used to come often, he recognized them and used to say, "Oh, the locusts are coming again." After the bishop's ordination, Bishop Matulionis was exiled to Šaduva, the new bishop Slatkevičius to the farthest town of Nemunėlio Radviliškis. Father Ioannis, at whose home the bishop's consecration had been performed, was brutally interrogated and imprisoned for 4 years. He was not afraid of that martyrdom. He used to say that for God's sake he could sacrifice his life, his wealth, and everything. And this is just nothing. He said, "If God saves us, we will live, and there is nothing to be afraid of." The state security documents found in the file of Bishop Matulionis testified that his persecution in Šaduva was even more fearful. They installed listening equipment at his home. The security were afraid that Bishop Matulionis might have direct relations with the Vatican, and with disobedience to Soviet authorities might even consecrate more bishops. In 1962, Pope John XXIII called together the Second Vatican Council, which was devoted to the renewal of the Universal Church. Teofilius Matulionis had just been appointed by the Pope as Archbishop and was also invited to the council as a special guest of the Holy See. Tension in the case of KGB surveillance increased. Search after search was made at his home. In the morning of August 17, in the same 1962, an unknown nurse came to Archbishop Matulionis' residence and, as he said, injected some vitamins. On August 20th, Archbishop Teofilius Matulionis died. The cause of his death is believed to be that of the injected poison. Although the security still observed even the dead patriarch of the church, many people saw their beloved pastor in his final journey to the crypt of the Kaišiadorys Cathedral, where Archbishop Teofilius Matulionis was buried and laid to final rest. In 1990, in the Kaišiadorys Diocese, there has been started a case of beatification of the bright memory of the servant of God, Archbishop Teofilius Matulionis. The enumeration of his heroic virtues are very extensive. Today we have the story of his life reflected in biographical books published not only in Lithuanian, but also in English, German, Spanish, and Portuguese. Having glorified his Lord and God by the sacrifice of his life and fruitful works, Archbishop Teofilius Matulionis was like the gospel's grain of wheat which fell into the soil of life to ripen and harvest among the plenty thorns and weeds. The experience of the Archbishop and his spiritual authority, which he gained through his life's journey and suffering, has become a shining star to many young priests, especially during the times of resistance. Numerous priests have derived their inspiration from the life of Archbishop Teofilius Matulionis. Like the biblical David in his battle against Goliath, armed only with faith and trust in God, Teofilius Matulionis not only withstood the brutal power and ideology in his spiritual struggle, but also laid the way to all who were struggling and longing for freedom and truth. The sound recording of this film in the English language has been done at the Catholic Television Studio in Kaunas, Lithuania.